So, hello once more friends, and today in this particular module I will be talking about how we at Koshish is a NGO based in rural Jharkhand, how we sort of set up our own palliative care system in a resource poor setting. So, this we call the Koshish model of care, and we go ahead a step in calling it Sandhi. Sandhi basically is a Sanskrit term which means to enjoin together. And I am Dr. Abhijit Dam, and I am the president of the National Association of Palliative Care for Ayush and Integrative Medicine. And having said that, we devised this new body, that is the National Association of Palliative Care for Ayush and Integrative Medicine, with the whole idea of creating a Sandhi, that is to enjoin, because we need to realize that the old systems, older cultural values and the older religious values and the social values also have an importance in overall quality of life of the patients whom we are dealing with on a daily basis. So, just by if we choose to ignore the prevailing other systems of medicine and healing and just focus on the so called scientific system of healing, then we are incomplete in providing a good quality of care, because here we are more focused on the quality of life of the patient, and especially at a time in diseases which has no cure. So, the question is that will we die in a manner consistent with the way we lived? So, the way in which we have lived in our own society with its social, cultural and religious values, which respects our personal values, spiritual beliefs, cultural background and preserves our dignity, and will we die a lonely death? Because death in today's modern world is not only more expensive, it is more prolonged and it is less dignified, and it actually can be more painful. So, we need to realize and accept that death is a physiology and not a pathology which can always be cured. So, death is a part of our life and we need to accept that fact, and we need to accept that fact that we would also die at some point of our lives, and what preparation do we have for our own mortality. So, this out here is a beautiful way to die, a death which is no longer seen in urban societies. So, dying out here, this lady is actively dying, and this is her husband standing by, and these are all the family members standing by, and this is her daughter-in-law giving her the last few drops of water as she is actively dying, and this is a beautiful way to die. But unfortunately, this picture is going to be a rarity very soon. And this is another picture, the elderly. The elderly in the yesteryears joint family system used to be taken care of by the grandchildren, because this was an extended family. But now, with the advent of nuclear families and with the migration of the rural population into urban areas, these elderly people are left all alone to fend for themselves. And statistics have actually shown that during the process of dying, in the last 2 years before a person dies, they require physical support. They are not in a state to perform their activities of daily living independently. So, those 2 years where they would require support, who is going to give them the support? Now, that is a question which should be bothering us, because the number of caregivers are dwindling by the day. Nobody wants to be a caregiver anymore until they are actually confronted with death itself, and then suddenly you realize that who is going to care for me, and then you are hospitalized, you are put into ICU, and where you die a undignified painful, lonely and prolonged period, over a prolonged period you finally die. So, as I said, it is very lonely. This is how the rural settings begin to look today, where the elderly are gradually becoming very lonely, because the youth are now migrating to the cities to earn a better living, and all the elderly do not have the good fortune to be independent physically. So, this was the background by which we introduced the concept of preventive palliation for the rural elderly to improve the quality of life. So, what we started off was by going down to the villages, to individual villages, and we started organizing health camps for the elderly. So, prevention by preventive palliation, early diagnosis of hypertension, early tackling of pain, early tackling of depression, early tackling of malnourishment and anemia, and by actually treating these things we could improve the quality of life. And what we found was the most important factor which was troubling the elderly was loneliness, because they had nobody to speak to. And this is how we created our teams, and this is how our teams, and these teams were, this is our volunteer who actually came all the way from Calcutta to help us. He volunteered and he still volunteers, and these are the village girls whom we train and empower, because these village girls are more acceptable in the society. The villages are small close societies, outsiders are not always welcome. So, to go into the house of an elderly and to examine that elderly can only be done by a person who is either of the same village or who is socially acceptable. So, the girls of these villages were socially acceptable by the community, and so we continue to train these girls over a period of 6 months to be palliative aids for the elderly and terminally ill. And this is how they keep going to each individual house. They sit down, talk to the elderly, normalize, they exchange laughter, basic health checkup is done, they give some basic foods like sattu is usually given. Sattu is a powdered which can easily be converted into a liquid gruel and taken by the family. You really do not have to cook it. And these are health camps which are being organized for the rural elderly, because the rural elderly are steeped in poverty. So, blankets, food, clothing is regularly distributed to them, in addition to health checkup camps. And this was the concept by which we actually set up our hospice. We purchased a piece of land, and this was way back in 2007, where I had no access to money, and I had actually had to take a loan out of my provident fund to buy this plot of land, and this photograph was taken way back in 2007, and there was this old building at that time which was in ruins. And then we gradually started building up, and these were the initial building blocks which came up, and today our hospice looks something like this over the years. And this is the latest photograph of our hospice, and this we actually built from scratch. So, this is the Koshish model of care which we are sharing with you in rural Jharkhand, and this is the first hospice in India which was set up in a rural setting. And then we found out, for care of the elderly had to come to the hospice. Initially we used to call the elderly to the hospice, but who would bring the elderly to the hospice? They could not come all alone. So, they had to rely on their grandchildren to escort them to the hospice. But why would the grandchildren come to the hospice unless you gave them something in return? So, we started feeding the grandchildren. So, we created a food system. So, the children would come to the hospice for the food, and they would bring their grandparents, and then we used to examine the elderly in the hospice campus itself. But then we found that sustaining such activities was not always feasible. So, once the children started coming, we started developing. These children had nothing better to do at that time. We started educating the children, value education, we started giving them value education. And then we sort of reversed the whole thing. For instead of the patients, instead of the elderly coming to the hospice, we started going out into the distant villages to take care of the elderly, and we had to face so many challenges, like there were no roads, there still are no roads. We had to cross rivers, small rivulets this way. So, we came to understand that good palliative care in the Indian context and in the social context that India stands for should be available. Availability is not an easy term. It has to be consistency. There has to be a consistency in availability with an optimal use of resources. Then there should be accessibility, there should be an affordability, and it should be socially acceptable. Right? We have always been taught that use the oral route as far as possible, but the village doctors, the jhola chhap doctors, they start an IV infusion at the drop of a hat. They will always start a IV infusion, and they are more socially accepted compared to a trained doctor. You know why? Because they treat the expectations of the patient and the family members. The patient and the family members expect that if a doctor comes home, then it is a big event and the doctor has to do something dramatic. And the jhola chhap doctors treat the patients not only physically, but also psychologically. So, that is the difference. So, we need to learn from those things as well. You might argue that this does not amount to an ethical practice, but in palliative care we are focusing on the overall quality of life, and if this improves the overall quality of life by providing beneficence and non-maleficence, then it definitely is worth it. Interventions like drainage of ascites, I had to do it at homes, because these patients who live in remote villages, it is not possible for them to even come to the nearest hospital or hospice. So, the things which you have to do out there, using the locally available resources, providing beneficence and being mindful of non-maleficence as well. So, that you had to do, and you have to do in those local circumstances. This was taken in the suburbs of Kolkata. I used to go to Kolkata quite a bit for providing palliative care in the deep interiors of Kolkata, and I had no clinic, and the car which I used to hire used to act as my clinic. The patients used to line up outside, and one patient I used to take inside, shut the door of the car, and that would become my clinic. I used to examine the patient, and the patient would come out, and the next patient would come in. So, you need to create resources, you need to make use of the best use of the available resources which are with you, rather than just complaining that you do not have resources. Resources are always there. As they say, God is always there, you just need the eyes to look out for it. So, this was way back in 2008 when I decided that to better understand palliative care, I should basically try to understand the needs of the people. So, I undertook a program which I called it the Hospice Tour India. Unfortunately, I had no access to funding, absolutely no funding, and I actually went begging to large hospices and large financial houses for funding. I did not get any. So, with whatever mere personal savings which we had, myself and an OT technician, two of us, we set out in the Hospice Tour India. we covered 8 states over 15 days. What was planned as a hospice tour pan India could only be reduced to 8 states because we did not have the funding. And during this period, we traveled through the smaller roads, through villages, we talked to people as to what were their expectations about the concept of palliative care. And we found this is was the greatest limitation to palliative care, greatest barrier, and this is poverty. So, unless you can address poverty, which is the basic requirement, quality of life always comes secondary to it. So, poverty is a big barrier towards provision of good palliative care, because for the poor a mouth less to feed is always desirable. So, we started in our hospice, we started feeding the rural children. We started a program of feeding the rural children. So, the children would come, we would feed them, and we would give them value education also, teach them how to be good responsible citizens. And in addition, we started distributing clothes and blankets for the elderly. We started our program for the rural elderly as well. We did not follow others blindly, just like the sheep jumping over and one following the other. Instead of this, we chose the road less travelled. We tried to actually find out what were the actual needs of the people before walking into that path. Here is an example of a huge dressing, bandaging for a case of CA breast. So, for this huge bandaging to take place, it would take a good part of an hour to make all these dressings and bandagings, and this lady would just take it out, rip it off within a period of a couple of hours after the bandaging was done. So, we thought out of the box, and here we used sanitary napkins, just 2 sanitary napkins would cover the whole area. So, this was thinking out of the box. In extreme situations, in patients where the patients were so poor they could not afford anything, in remote locations where there was no bandaging or dressing material available, we used to use banana leaves to cover the wounds. We used turmeric paste for anointing the wounds. Now, this is another example, this elderly widow. You see, she had cancer of the cervix. She was in initial pain, but we treated the pain, but the son came back to us and said that my mother can't sleep at night. And instead of blindly prescribing sedatives to her, we actually went and visited this elderly lady, and there we found out the cause why she could not sleep at night, and this was the cause why she could not sleep at night: flies. So, we just gave her a mosquito net, and she could sleep very comfortably at night. Morphine is a very important drug for providing good pain relief, but then if you argue that if I do not have morphine I cannot provide palliative care, then again you are wrong, because pain is a holistic concept. You need to focus not just on the physical aspect of the pain, but also the social, psychological and spiritual aspect of the pain, which forms 75% of the total pain concept. Now, are you a treater or a healer? It is seldom a medical man has true religious beliefs or true religious views, because there is too much pride of the intellect. We need to understand that there are other systems of medicine which also work, and if we are to improve the quality of life of a patient in a culturally appropriate manner, then we need to embrace all other complementary systems of medicine as well, and to help to integrate these into a common platform, so as to provide the best relief for the patient. Ritualisms also have a part to play, and especially as you get sicker and sicker, as one enters the terminal phase, as one approaches death, one becomes more and more religious, or one starts speaking searching for spiritual values, because one starts searching for meaning or purpose. One seeks meaning or purpose for their suffering, and this is where rituals would come in handy for people who believe in them. And this was all about creating angels, as I said, the village girls whom we train over a period of 6 months to be nursing aides. So, these are the women who then go down to the community level and examine the patients. So, a transition from ducklings into graceful swans. This was the first batch which passed out. And then we also devised the Bulbul finishing school for rural women, because these were basically girls from the local villages who were never exposed to modern practices, modern urban practices. So, tomorrow if they get a job in a household which is in an urban setting, they would not know how to adjust to that urban setting. So, we taught them basic table manners and how to serve tea and how to use a cup and a saucer, how to use spoons. And then we went a step further, divulging into aspects of parapsychology. And the first death doula structured course based on Indic perspectives was started, which we had aptly called Farishte, because death is not just an on off switch, it is a process. Dying is a process. There has been extensive work done by us on end of life dreams and visions, which again are an indirect evidence of the presence of an afterlife, and the importance that religion has to play in allaying the fear of dying in a terminally ill patient. And it is with these background missions and with the whole idea of integration that we established the National Association of Palliative Care for Ayush and Integrative Medicine, so that we have a beautiful platform where all streams and all people who have the unified vision to improve the quality of life for the dying can come together and work better for improving the quality of life for the dying people. This is a Siddha practice which you see going on. This is called Varmam, where specific pressure points are being massaged to give good relief for the patient. Because you see, visible light covers only 2% of the electromagnetic spectrum. Just because we do not see it does not mean that it does not exist. It still exists, and we need to appreciate, we need to acknowledge those other hidden spheres which also exist and embrace them. Thank you for your time.